A childhood in a brothel, the scars of sexual abuse, a mother who was a prostitute, decades drowning in addiction, and finally, a body doused in 151 proof rum and set ablaze, becoming a human torch screaming down a Los Angeles street. Any one of these tragedies would be enough to destroy a man, but the truth was far more brutal because Richard Pryor did something revolutionary. Instead of being consumed by his past, he turned it into his truth. He took the stage and told the raw, unvarnished stories of his life, and that brutal honesty made him an icon. His comedy albums won 5 Grammys, he starred in blockbuster films, and his influence was so profound that nearly every comedian who came after him considers him the greatest master of the art. But this genius came at a price. To make the world laugh, he had to constantly draw from his darkest memories. Gradually, the line between the artist on stage and the trauma that created him began to blur, fueling the addiction that ultimately led to the infamous fire on that summer night. To understand Richard Pryor, you must first understand the world that created him. Peoria, Illinois, in the 1940s was a city of stark contradictions. It was a gritty, industrial working-class town, home to Caterpillar tractors and Pop's Blue Ribbon beer. It was a place of factories and smokestacks, of tough, no-nonsense people trying to carve out a life in the American heartland. But beneath that veneer of Midwestern normalcy, Peoria had a dark and hidden underbelly. It was a city with a thriving underworld of gambling, vice, and secrets. And it was in the very heart of that secret world that Richard Franklin Lennox, Thomas Pryor, was born on December 1st, 1940. His life didn't begin in a hospital or a cozy family home. It began in a brothel. His grandmother, Marie Carter, was the formidable madam who ran the business. She was a tough, shrewd woman who had clawed her way to a position of power and relative wealth in a society that gave black women very few opportunities. The house was on North Washington Street in the city's red light district, a place where the lines between law and lawlessness were perpetually blurred. His mother, Gertrude, was one of his grandmother's working girls. His father, Leroy Buck Pryor, was a bartender, a former boxer, and his grandmother's enforcer. He was a handsome, charismatic man, but also a violent and volatile one. This was Richard's world. His home was his family's place of business. The aunts he grew up with were the women who worked for his grandmother. The men who came and went were their clients. From his earliest moments, he was an eyewitness to the rawest, most transactional aspects of human desire and despair. He saw things no child should ever see. He heard things no child should ever hear. There was no innocence, no shield from the harsh realities of life. He learned about sex not from awkward school talks, but from the sounds coming through the thin walls of his own home. He learned about violence from the explosive fights between his parents, from watching his father beat his mother. His mother, Gertrude, was a fleeting, almost ghostly presence in his life. When he was still a young boy, she left, abandoning him to the care of his grandmother. That abandonment carved a wound in him that would never fully heal. He would spend the rest of his life searching for the maternal love he never had, a quest that would lead him through a string of tumultuous and often destructive relationships. His grandmother, Marie, became the central figure in his upbringing. She was both his protector and his tormentor. She loved him in her own way, but her love was as tough and unforgiving as the world she inhabited. She was a strict disciplinarian, and the beatings were frequent and severe. He once recalled her telling him, "Boy, you ain't never gonna be shit," a phrase that echoed in his head for decades, a curse he spent his entire career trying to outrun. Yet amid the chaos and the cruelty, there was also a strange kind of education. In the brothel, Richard learned to be an observer. He became a student of human nature in its most unguarded state. He watched the pimps with their flashy clothes and smooth talk. He studied the Johns with their nervous guilt and fleeting fantasies. He listened to the stories of the women, their hopes, their heartbreaks, and their incredible resilience. He saw the masks people wore, and more importantly, he saw what happened when those masks came off. The brothel was his first stage, and its inhabitants were his first characters. They would later populate his comedy, transformed into figures like Mudbone, the wise old storyteller who had seen it all and could find the humor and humanity in the deepest degradation. But the darkness of his childhood went even deeper. In this environment where boundaries were non-existent, he became a victim of the very world that surrounded him. He was profoundly abused, first by a neighborhood teenager and later by a priest. It was a trauma he would carry in silence for years, a secret poison that seeped into his soul, fueling a profound sense of shame and self-loathing. He would only find the courage to speak about it publicly much later in life, turning his deepest wound into one of his most powerful and unsettling pieces of comedy. School offered little escape. He was a restless, troubled student, already marked as an outcast. He was the brothel boy, the kid from the wrong side of the tracks. He was smart, but his mind was elsewhere. He was a performer from the start, a class clown who used humor as a shield and a sword. It was his only defense against the pain, his only way to feel seen and to have some semblance of control. He discovered that if he could make people laugh, he could deflect their judgment and their pity. It was a survival mechanism that would become his life's work. He found another refuge in the movies. The local cinema was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the grim reality of Peoria and lose himself in worlds of glamour and adventure. He watched the great comedians of the day, Charlie Chaplin, Red Skelton, Jerry Lewis, and studied their timing, their physicality, their ability to command an audience. But one of his most significant, unexpected influences came not from a famous comedian, but from the fiery Pentecostal preachers of Peoria. He would watch men like Harold the Gospel Singer Franklin, mesmerized by their ability to command a room with rhythm, passion, and raw emotion, moving congregations to both laughter and tears. He was learning. He was absorbing everything. By the time he was a teenager, his path was already diverging from the one laid out for him. He dropped out of school after the 8th grade. He worked a series of odd jobs, a janitor, a packing house worker, but his heart was already on the stage. He started performing in small clubs and bars around Peoria, honing his craft, trying out different personas. At 17, seeking an escape and a sense of discipline he couldn't find at home, he joined the U.S. Army. His military career was short and turbulent. Stationed in West Germany, he spent more time performing in amateur shows and getting into trouble than he did being a soldier. In a characteristic incident of defiance against authority, he and several other black soldiers were involved in a brawl that ended with them beating and stabbing a white soldier who had been making racist remarks. Pryor spent time in a military prison for the offense. The experience only deepened his resentment of authority and his understanding of the simmering racial tensions that defined America. When he was discharged, he returned to Peoria, but not for long. He knew his future wasn't there. His stage had to be bigger. With a raw talent forged in trauma and a burning ambition to prove his grandmother wrong, Richard Pryor headed for the one place where a comedian's dreams could be made or broken: New York City. The Richard Pryor who arrived in Greenwich Village in the early 1960s was not the Richard Pryor the world would come to know. He was a young man with a mountain of pain on his back and a desperate need to be loved and accepted. And in the world of mainstream entertainment at that time, acceptance for a black comedian meant one thing. You had to be safe. You had to be non-threatening. You had to be, in short, Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby was the trailblazer. He had broken through the color barrier on television and in comedy clubs by creating a persona that was universally appealing. His comedy was about family, childhood, and the gentle absurdities of everyday life. It was clean, clever, and, most importantly, it was completely devoid of race. Cosby proved that a black man could be a superstar, but the unspoken price of that stardom was assimilation. You had to sand down your edges, suppress your anger, and never, ever make white audiences uncomfortable. This was the template for success, and Pryor, eager to escape his past and make a name for himself, followed it meticulously. He shed his profane, street-smart Peoria persona and adopted a clean-cut suit and tie image. He told charming stories and clever jokes. He smiled. He was a brilliant mimic, and he could do a flawless Cosby impression. And it worked. The clubs loved him. He was a polished, professional performer with impeccable timing. He started getting noticed. He made his television debut on the variety show On Broadway Tonight in 1964. Soon, he was a regular on programs hosted by Merv Griffin, Ed Sullivan, and Johnny Carson. He was on his way. He was becoming a star. He was playing by the rules, and he was winning the game. But inside, he was dying. Every night as he stood on stage in his sharp suit, telling jokes that had nothing to do with his real life, he felt like a fraud. This wasn't him. This was a character he was playing, a mask he was wearing to please people who knew nothing about the world he came from. The anger, the pain, the raw truth of his experience growing up in a brothel, the sting of racism, the chaos of his family, all of it was bottled up inside him, festering. His friends from that era could see the conflict raging within him. Offstage, he was still the wild, unpredictable, and brilliantly funny man from Peoria. But the moment he stepped into the spotlight, a switch would flip, and the sanitized white bread comic would appear. The tension was becoming unbearable. He was living a double life, and the strain was starting to show. He began to rely on alcohol and, increasingly, cocaine to numb the feeling of inauthenticity, to bridge the gap between the man he was and the star he was pretending to be. The pressure mounted as his fame grew. He moved to Los Angeles, signed a record deal, and released his first self-titled album in 1968. It was a solid, successful comedy album in the Cosby mold. He landed small roles in movies. He was checking all the boxes of success. He had a nice house, fancy cars, and the respect of the industry. He should have been happy. He was miserable. He felt like a trained animal, performing tricks for an audience that would be terrified if they ever met the real him. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the truths he wasn't allowed to tell. Something had to give. The dam of repression and conformity that he had so carefully constructed was beginning to crack. And in September 1967, at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, it finally broke in one of the most legendary meltdowns in show business history. Vegas was the pinnacle for a mainstream comedian in the 60s. A headlining gig at a major casino meant you had truly arrived. Pryor was booked at the Aladdin, a prime spot. The room was sold out. The audience was filled with the usual Vegas crowd, well-dressed, predominantly white tourists and high rollers. They were there to see the charming, funny young man from the Ed Sullivan Show. They had no idea they were about to witness an exorcism. Pryor walked out on stage, took one look at the expectant faces, and knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't tell another joke about his pet monkey. He couldn't do another charming little story. The fraudulence of it all overwhelmed him. The years of suppressed rage, the pain of his childhood, the hypocrisy of the world he was trying to fit into, it all came boiling to the surface. He stood there at the microphone, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. The audience grew restless. Then he looked out at the sea of faces, and in a quiet, chilling voice, he asked a question that hung in the air like a death sentence. What the fuck am I doing here? And then he walked off the stage. The club owner was furious. His managers were apoplectic. His career, for all intents and purposes, should have been over. You didn't do that in Las Vegas. You didn't walk out on a sold-out show. You didn't break the unspoken contract with the audience. But for Richard Pryor, it wasn't an end. It was a beginning. In that moment of professional suicide, he had finally liberated himself. He had killed the phony, sanitized comedian he had created, and in doing so, had given birth to the artist he was always meant to be. He disappeared from the mainstream for a while, retreating to Berkeley, California, the counterculture heartland. He let his hair grow out, embraced the radical politics of the time, and immersed himself in the world of Black Power activists like Huey P. Newton and writer activists like Ishmael Reed. He shed the suit and the smile and started to find his real voice. He began performing in small Black-owned clubs, places where he didn't have to censor himself. And what came out was a torrent. It was raw, profane, and shockingly honest. He started talking about everything he had been forced to hide: racism, police brutality, poverty, the absurdities of sex, and the deep, dark secrets of his own life. He wasn't just telling jokes anymore. He was bearing his soul. He was a preacher, a poet, and a prophet of pain, all rolled into one. He was inventing a new language for comedy, a language that was forged in the fire of his own experience. The king was dead. Long live the king. The Richard Pryor that emerged from his self-imposed exile in Berkeley was a transformed man. He was no longer trying to be a black version of a white comedian. He was something entirely new, something dangerous and vital. He took the stage not in a suit, but in dashikis or leather jackets, his hair grown into an afro. He moved with the nervous, kinetic energy of a cornered animal, a live wire of emotion and intellect. The microphone was no longer just a tool. It was an extension of his being, a conduit through which he channeled the raw, unfiltered truth of his life and the world as he saw it. He returned to the comedy scene not as a polished entertainer, but as a truth-teller. His new material was a Molotov cocktail thrown into the polite, sanitized world of stand-up comedy. He dove headfirst into the subjects that mainstream comics wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole: race, class, politics, and the brutal realities of life in Black America. He gave voice to the voiceless, creating unforgettable characters drawn from the world he knew: winos, junkies, pimps, and prostitutes. He didn't mock them. He inhabited them, imbuing them with a dignity and humanity that was both hilarious and heartbreaking. His most famous creation from this period was Mudbone, an old wise philosopher from Peoria who would sit on a metaphorical porch and spin tales of hardship and survival. Through Mudbone, Pryor could talk about the history of slavery, the pain of segregation, and the wisdom of the common man in a way that was accessible, profound, and devastatingly funny. He wasn't just a comedian anymore. He was a social commentator, a street corner griot, continuing a long tradition of African American storytelling. His language was revolutionary. He used profanity not for shock value, but as a tool for authenticity. It was the language of the streets, the language of real people. And most controversially, he reclaimed the N-word. He seized the most hateful word in the English language and turned it on its head. In his mouth, it could be a term of endearment, a punctuation mark, a weapon of defiance, or a brutal reminder of America's racial sickness. He wielded it with a complexity and nuance that no one had ever dared to before, forcing audiences of all races to confront the power and the pain embedded in that single word. In 1974, he released the album That Ends Crazy. The title alone was an act of defiance. The record label, Stax Records, was hesitant, but Pryor insisted. The album was a commercial and critical smash hit. It won the Grammy Award for Best Comedy Album and went on to sell over 1 million copies. It was a cultural phenomenon. It announced to the world that a new king had been crowned. Richard Pryor was no longer just a comedian. He was a superstar, and he had done it entirely on his own terms. The albums that followed, Is It Something I Said? Bicentennial Inn, and the concert film, Richard Pryor, Live in Concert, cemented his status as a genius. Live in Concert, filmed in 1979, is widely considered one of the greatest stand-up performances ever recorded. In it, Pryor is at the absolute peak of his powers. He's a master of physical comedy, contorting his body to become a deer in the headlights, a slick pimp, or his own heart attacking itself. He seamlessly weaves together stories about his childhood, his struggles with drugs, and his observations on race relations, creating a 78-minute monologue that is as cohesive and emotionally resonant as a great play. Hollywood, which had once been wary of his new radical persona, now came calling with open arms. They couldn't ignore his talent or his massive commercial appeal. He began a fruitful and iconic partnership with actor Gene Wilder. Their on-screen chemistry was electric. In films like Silver Streak, 1976, and Stir Crazy, 1980, their dynamic, Wilder as the lovable, neurotic straight man, and Pryor as the unpredictable, street-smart live wire, created comedy gold. Stir Crazy, directed by Sidney Poitier, became one of the highest-grossing films ever made by a black director at the time. Pryor was now a bona fide movie star, one of the most bankable and powerful black men in Hollywood. He had it all: the fame, the money, the critical acclaim. He had proven his grandmother and the entire world wrong. The boy from the brothel was the king of the world. But even at this zenith of his fame, a journey in 1979 would alter his consciousness in the course of his comedy. He traveled to Africa, visiting Kenya and Zimbabwe. It was a pilgrimage, a journey to the land of his ancestors. He went there as a tourist, a famous American celebrity, but the experience was far more profound than he could have anticipated. He walked through the streets of Nairobi, surrounded by people who looked like him. He saw black men and women in positions of power as politicians, business owners, police officers. He saw a world where blackness was not an exception or a minority status, but the norm. It was a revelation. He felt a sense of belonging, a connection to a history, and a culture that had been stolen from him and his ancestors by slavery. He later described a moment of epiphany. As he looked at the faces of the people around him, he realized he could never again use the N-word on stage. The word, which he had so masterfully wielded as a tool of social commentary and a term of defiant camaraderie, suddenly felt hollow and ugly. In the context of Africa, in the presence of his heritage, he understood its true weight as a weapon of dehumanization, a scar left by white supremacy. When he returned to America, he announced his decision publicly. "There are no in here," he said of his trip to Africa. "I am not going to call a black person A-N again." The decision was met with a firestorm of controversy. Many in the black community praised his newfound consciousness and supported his decision. But others, including some fellow comedians, criticized him. They argued that he was the one who had given the word its power in a comedic context, that he had defanged it and made it their own. They accused him of being preachy, of turning his back on the very audience and the very style that had made him a star. Pryor stood his ground. He knew his evolution would alienate some people, but he couldn't go back. The trip had opened his eyes, and he could no longer participate in what he now saw as a form of verbal self-mutilation. It was a brave and principled stand, a testament to his capacity for growth. The man who had once been the ultimate iconoclast was now willing to break with his own iconic style in the pursuit of a deeper truth. It showed that his honesty was not just a performance, it was a lifelong journey. But the kingdom was built on a foundation of pain, and the ghosts of Peoria were not so easily banished. As his success grew, so did his demons. The self-loathing and insecurity that had plagued him since childhood were still there, gnawing at him from the inside. He was terrified of losing everything, convinced that he didn't deserve his success. And to quiet those voices, he turned to the one thing that had always offered him a temporary escape: cocaine. His drug use, which had been a part of his life for years, now escalated into a full-blown, all-consuming addiction. The cocaine that had once fueled his creativity and energy now began to destroy him. It stoked his paranoia to terrifying levels. He became convinced that people were trying to kill him, that his house was bugged, that everyone was plotting against him. He would barricade himself in his mansion in the San Fernando Valley for days on end, surrounded by guns and mountains of cocaine, lost in a labyrinth of fear and delusion. His personal life, always chaotic, descended into pure hell. His relationships with women were a whirlwind of passion, jealousy, and violence. He married 7 times to 5 different women, remarrying 2 of them, and had numerous other relationships, most famously with actress Pam Grier. These relationships were often marred by his drug-fueled rages and accusations of domestic abuse. He was a man desperate for love, but utterly incapable of sustaining it. The same vulnerability and emotional nakedness that made him a genius on stage made him a monster in his private life. His professional life began to suffer as well. He became notoriously unreliable, showing up late to film sets, if he showed up at all. He got into disputes with directors and producers. He made a series of baffling career choices, starring in forgettable or outright terrible films like The Toy and Superman 3, cashing huge paychecks for movies that were far beneath his talent. He did, however, deliver one of the most powerful dramatic performances of his career in the 1978 film Blue Collar, playing a disillusioned auto worker. The film was a raw and unflinching look at the lives of working-class men, and Pryor's performance was a stunning reminder of the incredible dramatic actor he could be. But those moments of brilliance became rarer as the drugs tightened their grip. He was a man at war with himself, and the world watched as he self-destructed in public. In 1977, he had a massive heart attack brought on by his heavy smoking and cocaine use. He was only 37 years old. The experience terrified him, and he incorporated it into his act, finding the dark humor in his own mortality. But even a brush with death couldn't stop his downward spiral. He was trapped. The fame he had craved had become a prison. The money he had earned couldn't buy him peace. The laughter of millions couldn't drown out the screaming in his own head. He was the king of comedy, but he was the loneliest man in the world, lost in a blizzard of white powder and paranoia. He was a human inferno, burning brighter and hotter than anyone, and it was only a matter of time before he was consumed by his own flames. The only question was when. The night of June 9th, 1980, began like many nights at Richard Pryor's sprawling mansion on Parthenia Street in Northridge. a quiet suburb in the San Fernando Valley. It was a fortress of fame, but on this night, it was a pressure cooker of paranoia and despair. Pryor had been on a multi-day cocaine binge, freebasing the drug, a method that involves chemically converting cocaine powder into a purer, smokable form, producing a short-lived but incredibly intense high. He hadn't slept in days. He was surrounded by a handful of people, including his aunt and one of his ex-wives, but he was utterly alone in his own tormented mind. The voices in his head were screaming at him. He was haunted by visions, by the ghost of a man he had once seen immolate himself in a park. He was plagued by a sense of impending doom, a feeling that his life was spinning out of control, and that the only way to regain power was through a dramatic, cleansing act of destruction. He would later describe the feeling as a spiritual crisis, a moment where he felt a need to be reborn, to burn away the old, corrupted self. In the warped logic of his drug-addled mind, fire seemed like the only answer. He calmly walked into his living room, picked up a bottle of 151 proof Ronrico rum, and went into the dining room. There, in front of his horrified aunt, he poured the flammable liquid all over his torso and head. Before anyone could react, he flicked a disposable lighter. The world exploded in a ball of orange flame. He became a human torch engulfed in fire from the waist up. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. The drug-induced psychosis shattered, replaced by the primal, searing agony of being burned alive. In a state of pure, instinctual panic, he ran. He ran out of the house, through the front gate and down the quiet suburban street, screaming. He was a living, breathing vision of hell, a flaming specter tearing through the peaceful California night. A police officer, who just happened to be patrolling the area, saw the unbelievable sight. He later described it as something out of a horror movie. A motorist, Bill Witt, was driving by with his wife and children when he saw Pryor running towards him, still on fire. Witt, thinking quickly, swerved his car to block Pryor's path and get him to stop running, which was only fanning the flames. By the time paramedics arrived, Pryor was lying on the sidewalk smoldering. He was conscious but in a state of profound shock. An officer knelt beside him and asked the obvious question, "What happened?" Pryor, in a moment of dark, surreal clarity that could have come straight from one of his routines, looked up at him and said, "I was trying to freebase, and I lit a match." He was rushed to the Sherman Oaks Burn Center, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. The prognosis was grim. He had suffered third-degree burns over more than 50% of his body. For the next 6 weeks, he hovered between life and death. He underwent multiple painful surgeries and skin grafts. The recovery process was excruciating, a daily battle against infection and unimaginable pain. The world reacted with a mixture of shock, horror, and morbid fascination. The official story, initially put out by his team, was that it had been a freak accident involving ether used in the freebasing process, but the truth, as Pryor himself would later admit, was far more disturbing. This wasn't an accident. It was a suicide attempt, a desperate, drug-fueled cry for help from a man who had reached the absolute bottom. The incident became a cultural touchstone, a grim punchline that exposed the dark side of fame and addiction. But for Richard Pryor, it was a crucible. Lying in that hospital bed, stripped of his fame, his dignity, and nearly his life, he was forced to confront the man in the mirror. He had literally been to hell and back, and if he was going to survive, he had to find a way to make sense of it, to turn the ugliest, most painful moment of his life into something meaningful. Slowly, miraculously, he began to heal. Physically, the scars would remain forever, but emotionally and spiritually, something had shifted. The fire had burned away the paranoia and the madness. It had given him a terrifying moment of clarity. He had a second chance, and he knew he couldn't waste it. As he recovered, he began to do what he had always done. He started to write. He started to process the trauma, to find the words, to find the humor in the horror. He knew he had to go back on stage. He knew he had to talk about it. It was the only way he knew how to heal. In 1982, less than 2 years after the incident, he walked onto the stage of the Hollywood Palladium to film his next concert movie, Richard Pryor, Live on the Sunset Strip. He was thinner, more fragile. The swagger was tempered with a new vulnerability. The audience held its breath, wondering what he would say, how he would address the elephant in the room. He didn't shy away from it. He dove right in, delivering what is arguably the most courageous and brilliant 10 minutes in the history of stand-up comedy. He told the story of the fire. He talked about the pipe, the cocaine, and the voice in his head. He personified the flame, giving it a personality, talking to it like an old friend. You know what the flame said to me? It said, "Hey, Rich, what you doing?" He acted out running down the street, the flames trailing behind him, and the reactions of the police and paramedics. He took his audience on a journey into the heart of his own private hell, and he made them laugh. It wasn't just laughter of amusement. It was laughter of recognition, of relief, of profound empathy. He had taken his greatest pain and transformed it into a shared human experience. He had looked death in the face and come back with a punchline. It was an act of artistic alchemy, a resurrection. The man who had been consumed by fire had risen from the ashes, not just a survivor, but a master who had turned his scars into his greatest masterpiece. The journey back from the brink was not a straight line for Richard Pryor. The fire had been a wake-up call, but the demons of addiction were persistent. His comeback in Live on the Sunset Strip was a monumental artistic triumph, but the path to sobriety was a daily struggle, marked by relapses and the hard, unglamorous work of recovery. Yet something fundamental within him had changed. The fire had forced a reckoning, and it set him on a path of introspection and growth that would define his later years. His career in the 1980s continued, but the landscape was changing. The raw, revolutionary energy of the 70s was giving way to the more polished commercial comedy of the 80s. A new generation of black comedians led by Eddie Murphy, a man who openly worshiped Pryor and was heavily influenced by him, was taking over. Pryor continued to make movies, but many of them, like the ill-fated JoJo Dancer, Your Life is Calling, a semi-autobiographical film he wrote, directed, and starred in, failed to connect with audiences. He seemed to be searching for a new voice, a new direction, but he struggled to find his footing in this new era. Then in 1986, fate dealt him another devastating blow. He began experiencing strange symptoms, dizziness, numbness, a loss of coordination. After a series of tests, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative disease of the central nervous system. The diagnosis was a cruel and tragic irony. For a comedian whose genius was so rooted in his physicality, whose body was as much an instrument as his voice, MS was a particularly vicious sentence. The disease began its slow, relentless assault on his body, stripping him of his mobility and his control. The live wire was being unplugged one nerve at a time. For a while he tried to hide it. He was a proud man and he didn't want the world's pity. But the disease was impossible to conceal. His movements became stiff, his speech slurred. He began using a cane, then a walker, and finally he was confined to a motorized scooter. But even as his body failed him, his spirit and his sense of humor refused to surrender. He continued to perform sporadically, incorporating his illness into his act with the same unflinching honesty he had brought to everything else in his life. He would roll onto the stage in his scooter and joke about the indignities of his condition. "I have MS," he told one audience. "It's not that bad. The pussy's still good." The laughter was different now. It was tinged with sadness and admiration for his incredible courage. His final years were a quiet battle fought largely out of the public eye. He was cared for by his family, including Jennifer Lee, one of his ex-wives, who returned to his life and remarried him in 2001, becoming his devoted caregiver until the end. He continued to write and to observe the world, his mind still sharp even as his body betrayed him. He received numerous accolades, including the very first Mark Twain Prize for American Humor in 1998, a recognition of his towering contribution to the art form. On December 10, 2005, just 9 days after his 65th birthday, Richard Pryor died of a heart attack. His death marked the end of an era. The fire, which had defined so much of his life and his art, was finally extinguished. What is the legacy of a man like Richard Pryor? It's impossible to overstate his influence. He didn't just change comedy, he shattered it and rebuilt it in his own image. Before Pryor, stand-up was largely a craft of jokes and one-liners. After Pryor, it became an art form of personal confession, a platform for social commentary, and a forum for the most dangerous kind of truth-telling. Every comedian who came after him, particularly every black comedian, owes him a debt. From Eddie Murphy and Chris Rock to Dave Chappelle and Kevin Hart, the lineage is direct and undeniable. He kicked down the doors of convention and censorship, clearing a path for others to walk through. He proved that you could be unapologetically black, fiercely political, and deeply personal on stage and still become a global superstar. He created the very template for the modern stand-up comic as a public intellectual and a cultural critic. But his significance extends beyond the world of comedy. His story is a powerful, if painful, exploration of the relationship between art and suffering. It raises the unsettling question: was his genius a product of his pain? Would he have been as brilliant, as insightful, as revolutionary if he hadn't endured the horrors of his childhood? It's a question with no easy answer. His trauma gave him a unique and profound understanding of the human condition, but it also fueled the addiction and self-loathing that nearly destroyed him. He was a man who mined his own wounds for comedic gold, but he paid for that gold with his own blood. His life was a study in contradictions. He was a champion of the downtrodden who could be cruel to those closest to him. He was a truth teller who lived a life shrouded in the lies of addiction. He was a man who craved love but was terrified of intimacy. He was a survivor who spent his life trying to destroy himself. He was, in the end, profoundly, tragically, and beautifully human. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy is his unwavering commitment to honesty, no matter the cost. In a world of carefully constructed images and public relations, Richard Pryor put his entire messy, broken, and brilliant self on display. He showed us that our deepest wounds, our greatest shames, and our most profound fears are not things to be hidden, but are in fact the very things that connect us to one another. He taught us that the most powerful laughter often comes from the darkest places, and that by laughing at our pain, we can, for a moment, transcend it. His life was not a simple story of triumph. It was a chaotic, often ugly, and deeply sad story. But it was also a story of incredible courage, of a man who refused to be silenced, who insisted on telling his truth, even when it was painful to hear and even more painful to live. He walked through fire, both literally and metaphorically, and he came back to tell us what he saw. He was the king, not just of comedy, but of a brutal, unflinching honesty that we may never see again. And in a world that often seems to demand our silence and our conformity, his voice, raw, defiant, and hilariously human, echoes on, reminding us of the liberating power of telling the truth,